Good evening. Glad you're able to make it. Kind of hoping we were all be able to get together during this time to continue to work through Daniel, but since we're not, I thought this would be the best option and best way to present Daniel chapter 6 tonight. Hope everyone is doing well and having at least some pleasure in this time of a little bit of uncertainty out there. So let me pray for us, and then we'll get going here. Heavenly Father, thank you for the book of Daniel, and thank you for this community, this church, for the people here who love you and want to know more about you and to know more about your word and what it means to them and how they can use it in their lives. And continue to be with us all through this time of just trying to figure things out. Just let us be people of hope, people of light who shines light in the darkness. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to do Daniel 6. For those of you who've typically been following along, we did a little bit of Daniel 6 last time we met. We did kind of an intro and then a couple verses within it, but I think what I thought we would do tonight is do all of chapter 6 this evening, and then over the next several weeks we'll continue on through the rest of the book of Daniel. So as we get going here, we need to kind of remember we're making a transition from the Babylonian rule to the Persian rule. So we had the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Nabonidus, several others along the way. And at the end of chapter 5, if you guys go back and look, a Mede shows up there in the final verse of chapter 5, verse 30. And this Mede is known as Darius, but there's a lot of debate about who this Darius is. Someone referred to him as Darius, depending on where he went to seminary. And this is something that we'll talk about just a little bit here. This Darius. Let me take a second before we get to Darius. Anyways, Daniel survived. He's probably in his mid-80s at this point. He survived the Babylonians. He's now with the Persians. This will be the last actual group he works with. He had the Babylonians, now the Persians. We know from the four beasts that there's at least two other nations that are coming along. It's going to be the Romans. I'm sorry, the Greeks and then the Romans. And but right now we're dealing with the Persians. We're probably about 539 BC. This is what's happening here is that the Persians, who are a little bit nicer than the Babylonians, were allowing people to go back to Judah. So the exiles, such as Zechariah, had gone back to Judah at this time to go rebuild the temple. So you guys can go look back at that. So we are in a post-exile time. Many Jewish people decided to stay with the Medo-Persians and stayed within that kingdom. And as like Daniel, he stayed in the kingdom and worked with Darius, as well as other satraps. And so what we learn here is that what the Babylonians, the Persians were doing at this point is they were setting up satrapies, or you'd have satraps, which were like governors ruling over these different areas. And pretty much they were kind of puppet regimes to make sure that the people in all these nations or all these people groups were paying their taxes and not causing too much problems and not rebelling. And so that's what they would do. And of course, though the Persians were relatively nice compared to the Babylonians, they would still decide to, kill people and take people out as necessary. So this is the last account that we have of Daniel's life. The rest of Daniel from chapter 7 forward is going to deal more with his visions. And so that's where a lot of the prophecies come in, a lot of the eschatological viewpoints and stuff related to that. It comes in during that time. So before we get too far along here, what I want to do is be able to say that there is a chat function there on the right hand side of your screen. If you log in either with a Google or a YouTube account, you can ask questions. I'd be happy to answer those throughout. You can watch this video without logging in, as you probably see for those of you who are currently watching. But there is that option to be able to do that. So I'll be looking at my screen here to see if any questions pop up, and be happy to answer those as we go through. You don't have to, but it is, that option is there. The first person we're going to meet, and the last person we met in chapter 5, and the first person we'll meet in chapter 6 is Darius. And the thing is that there are actually three different Dariuses out there. They're Persians. They're both Persians and Medes, and sometimes those words are interchangeable. The two nations had kind of formed together in a very interesting way, and Persians and Medes intermarried, and a lot of history there that we don't have time to go through tonight. One of the Dariuses we know of, you've probably heard of in Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. But there is another Darius that we know about in Daniel who probably wasn't Darius. He probably had he could have been. Let's just go through who he could have been. Very possibly, he could have been Cyrus the Persian, or known as Cyrus II or Cyrus II. We'll see that in 628 of this chapter. Could have also been a guy by the name of Gubaru, which is kind of a fun name. Not the same as Ugabaru, which we learned about in chapter 5, who was a general of Cyrus's army. But this guy was Gubaru was a governor of Persia, and he was part of the group that helped take out the Babylonians, and eventually could have been possibly put in place. Gubaru, they believe, was probably appointed as a king or a leader over, or a governor probably is a better way to say it, over Babylon in around 539, or some area of Babylon in 539. You remember, Babylon is a huge area. He then would appoint other governors, and we see that there in chapter 6. There's 120 satraps that you see there in verse 1 of chapter 6. So that's one option. We know a little bit of context here that this person named Darius was 62 years old. We'll see that at the end of, we saw that at the end of chapter 5. We'll see that he was also probably the son of Ahasuerus, who was a Mede. We'll see that in chapter 9. A lot of things point to it being Cyrus II, who was the subordinate of Cyrus, or also someone known as Prince Cambyses. It almost feels like we're in a Narnia book series here at this point as we go through all these fun names. There is disagreement about that, since there seems to be a separate person in verse 28 of chapter 6 who's known as Darius. There's also some debate about this Darius not being Gubaru, but not also being Cyrus, or even possibly being a guy, like I said, Cambyses is another name. But he wasn't 62 years old during this time, and did not become king of the empire until 529 BC, so we're about 10 years ahead at this point. So his first year could not have preceded, of course, Darius's third year, 536. There's even more complication here. Cyrus and Cambyses, they were not Medes. There seems to be evidence that there was a Mede here, because they're not related to Ahasuerus. That's always a fun name to say. So there's just a lot going on here. The debate can go on further and further about who Darius was based on who his mothers were, or who his mother was, and who his father was, and that sort of thing. So we'll go a little bit deeper into it, because I know you're just dying to know more about who this Darius guy is, because he plays a very large role here. As we look at Daniel and the lion's den, there's a significant role. Remember Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the king, the very last king. Well, he wasn't really a king. He was kind of he was a co-king. He was actually the prince of Nabonidus, who was supposed to be the king during the last chapter 5. Belshazzar was put into place, and he's referred to as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but he is actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, as we know, because the use of son there was actually descendant, and there's some references back and forth to that. So we have Belshazzar who played that role, and then we have this Cyrus, or this Darius, who came in, and there's some people who would say that Darius and Cyrus reigned simultaneously. Very possible that happened. You could also see that you could bring Gubaru back into this, and I think he's the most solid guy. He's the most solid option for this, based on everything I've seen. He would have been about that age, the age that we see 62 years old there at chapter 531. Very likely that he had a role in being a governor already, and was being brought in to continue to keep the role of being governor. At this point, he reigned in Babylon, and we think specifically in this area from 539 to 525. He is very powerful. He is known based on a lot of different Babylonian text. So outside of the Bible, text that you'd find outside the Bible, he was known to have a lot of influence in that regard and a lot of power, wealth, camels, you name it, he had it. Actually, didn't have camels. But anyways, he was very powerful governor. So with all that said, it seems like Darius is not Cyrus, but he's actually a guy by the name of Gubaru. And I'd probably, Gubaru just sounds fun because it's Gubaru, but it could be Gubero. You probably need some more guttural into that. But anyways, that's who this person is. And I know that it is something that was dying. You guys were just dying to know. And it's something that you'll never have to really think about again. But it is something that I find to be interesting. What is fascinating about this is the geopolitical implications of the Babylonians and the Persians, how they did not like each other, how the Persians eventually took over the Babylonians because the Babylonians got a little too arrogant, having a little too much fun, and the Persians came in, and they actually didn't see them coming in until it was just way too late. So you see all that sort of stuff, and Egypt played a role in this, and there are other nations involved that you don't really get to hear about unless you look at history outside of the Bible. And there's a lot of just geopolitical stuff going on behind the scenes that we see here that leads to all of this. There's a lot of context, a lot of stuff that we deal with a lot of polytheistic stuff that we're going to see related to Daniel's belief, being a monotheistic person, which some people would even refer to him as an atheist because they only believed in one God versus multiple gods. That was a problem also for our friends in the Gospels, but that's a whole other story and a whole other class we'll be doing on that. But without further delay, let's jump into Daniel chapter 6. I would ask you to read, but it'd be hard to do that unless you wanted to type it out word for word as we did this, but that'd be tedious. So let me read here from chapter 6, verse 1. I'll go do 6:9, and we'll work from there. It seemed like a good idea to Darius, to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps. So satraps, as I said, were governors. 120 of them. A significant amount. Don't see a lot of symbolism here. Could have been. You guys could probably look that up if you want to, but I haven't seen anything related to that. Who would be in charge of the entire kingdom. So you can imagine the sizes. You have 120 governors. Yeah. But over these 120 would be 3 supervisors, one of whom was Daniel. These satraps were accountable to them, so the king's interests might not incur damage. So it was all really still, of course, about the king. Of course it's about the king. It's always about the king. To this day, it's about the king. Now, this Daniel was distinguished. Now this Daniel. See how he's being referred to here? After this, Daniel starts referring to himself in first person. Now, did he write this? There's a debate about that. But did he write the last part where he's actually speaking? Well, probably someone wrote it for him, but he is speaking in first person. We'll notice the tense changes as we go into the next chapters. So now this Daniel was distinguishing himself above the other supervisors and satraps, for he had an extraordinary spirit. And what they mean by an extraordinary spirit is that he had a spirit of a god. He was a powerful spirit. It wasn't like he just was a spirited guy. He had a spirit of a god inside of him. In fact, the king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. As you can see, most people won't be happy with that. Consequently, the supervisors and satraps were trying to find some pretext against Daniel in connection with administrative matters, but they were unable to find any such damaging evidence because he was trustworthy and guilty of no negligence or corruption. So these men concluded, we won't find any pretext against this man Daniel unless it is in connection with this law, with the law of his God. And I'm not going, okay. Continue here. Don't want to get sidetracked. So these supervisors and satraps came by collusion to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. To all the supervisors of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, counselors, and governors. That list of people, we see those lists before, right? They're Chaldeans and magicians and others, but they list for a reason. We'll talk about that. We've talked about that in other weeks, but for those of you following along, we'll discuss that too. It seemed like a good idea for a royal edict to be issued and an interdict to be enforced for the next 30 days. Anyone who prays to any god or human other than you O king, should be thrown into a den of lions. And I would say, depending on your translation there, that is either praise or petition to, and it actually doesn't really mean praying. Where am I? Let me pull up the right thing here. Yep. If you're reading the NASB, it says petition. There's a reason it says that. I'm reading right now the Net Bible. I'm not sure why I decided to use this tonight, but I am. Anyways, it's an extremely good technical Bible, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Now let the king issue a written interdict. I already read that. So it cannot be altered according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed. So King Darius issued the written interdict. And again, not a great usage of that word there, but if you looked at the end of that, you guys probably see injunction or something related to that. So we'll go back to that here. And that's the beauty of having multiple translations, is that those who were translating at the time had different ways of interpreting the same word. And people to this day still interpret some of these words very differently. That's not about this class at this point, but there's a lot of stuff out there that is being not retranslated, but looked at from a different angle. And just because the Hebrew and Greek language is so amazing. But also that you have to think that the Hebrew had very few words compared to the English language. And because of that, they use multiple words in many different ways. So anyways, let's look at these guys. So we have Darius, who does this, 120 satraps, points them over the entire empire. We are not sure who the other two commissioners or supervisors are, depending on your translation. There probably could have been, especially over the 120 other people, they probably weren't Medes or Persians necessarily, because you got to think, you've got Daniel here, who was a Jew from Judah, a Judean, and they do make a point of that later on. They could have been maybe Babylonians who made nice of the Persians. It could have been other nations. I would probably lean to mainly as Medes and Persians and Daniel, but it could have also been the three friends. We don't ever really know what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego after their incident earlier on in this book. So it could be something. It could be a mix of nations, or it could be Medes and Persians and Daniel. Either way, the Bible doesn't tell us, but I imagine if you dug pretty deep into Babylonian history, you'd be able to see some of that. So we have these three satraps. They were accountable to make sure that the king's interests might not incur any damage, and which of course was something that made sense. But Daniel here, so we'll just talk about Daniel a little bit here. There in verse 3, was distinguishing himself above the other supervisors and satraps. The spirit, the people. Okay, so remember, so think about this from the context of what's going on here. Someone is writing about Daniel at this point, right? And the author's intent is that he does not like Persians or Medes, Persian Medes, Medes Persians, Medo-Persians, however you want to say it. He doesn't like the Babylonians, as we saw earlier on. He thought Nebuchadnezzar was arrogant, Belshazzar was arrogant. So he wrote about him in that very way to make him look arrogant. He's writing to make a point here to the people who are in exile, or now post-exile, who have forgotten who God was. Many of them did. Many of them forgot to live as Jews, or what that tradition was. This author is trying to remind them of who Daniel is, who is now a national hero, especially if you go years later, he is to this day, who God is, their God is, Yahweh, and to help them all remember that, and to see that the spirit that Daniel has in him is the monotheistic spirit of God. Now, would you go as far as the Holy Spirit? You could. Or you could not. It doesn't say. It just says that he had an extraordinary spirit. To the author's viewpoint, to the viewpoint of the people watching, following along, they knew that there was something special about Daniel, and it was something very, almost not divine. Not that he was divine, but there was some sort of divine presence within him that would come up. So he was so extraordinary that the king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Have you ever heard that happen before? Maybe we could go back to Joseph, right? That's a common thing that happens here with our Jewish friends as they are for some reason thrown into captivity, brought into exile, kidnapped, sold, whatever. They, through the power of God and through God's intervention, are people who become powerful leaders, and that's what we're seeing with Daniel. So they're trying to figure out what was going on with him, and what they ended up figuring out here is that the weak point for Daniel would be that it would be based on his own laws, his own beliefs. The idea that he was a monotheistic person and that he only believed in Yahweh. So you got to think that he was living in an extreme tension. All the Jews at that time, especially those who were still following Yahweh, were living in this tension of, I'm living in this polytheistic world that has none of the same ideas, traditions, beliefs that I have. I'm trying to live as a Jew should, and there's that tension, constant tension that's going on here between the monotheistic viewpoint and the polytheistic viewpoint. What we also see throughout this book, and as well as a lot of the Old Testament, is that we have this God who's a redeemer, we have this God who's a savior, and while at the same time, all of our Jewish friends seem to get into a bind at some point, much like Daniel's about to here in the lion's den. But what always happens, God redeems and God saves and God's sovereign. So we see that going on throughout this. So as we go into verse 6, they were not able to find anything, any sort of damaging evidence. He was a very trustworthy guy. He didn't steal things. He wasn't lying. He wasn't going to the king and trying to manipulate the king in any way. He wasn't stealing extra money, taking taxes that he didn't need to take. Apparently he was doing everything extremely by the book, and the only thing that he was doing is that he would pray to his one and only God, and he wouldn't pray to the other gods, and that would really upset these people. As you can see, anytime you go against the culture, just like Daniel would, anytime you go against the culture, people are going to go against you. People will fight back against that because it makes them uncomfortable. So we continue on here. So in verse 6, they came to the king, and the way you say, "O King Darius, live forever," that was, if you didn't go in and introduce yourself that way or praise the king, you got to remember, a lot of times the kings, governors, whoever this person was, but the people in charge thought they had some sort of divine ability or were divine themselves. And so the idea of, "O King Darius, live forever," I'm going to walk in and say that because I want to get on your good side, because what I'm about to say is probably a favor, or I'm going to ask you to do something that you may not want to do, or I'm going to manipulate you into doing it, or I'm going to figure out a weak point, or identify your arrogance, and how am I going to get into this and figure out who you are, and how I'm going to manipulate you. So they come in and they do this. So we have this monarchy, this king who is leading, who thinks he's divine, and who's highly looked upon, because he's like, "O king, live forever. You're the most fine. You're this all powerful person." You have to remember, Nebuchadnezzar thought that. As we looked in earlier on, other kings thought that. Jewish kings thought that, to be honest. There are some who thought that, and it was just very. It's just something that they very much had to deal with. But the idea and the tension that the author is trying to put into this here is that you have Yahweh, who is truly the powerful king, who is going to live forever, and you have this earthly king, who is Darius at this point, who possibly could think he could live forever, and you have this tension. We're getting this the tension is starting to build, and it's going to end up with Daniel thrown into a lion's den. But there is a tension that is going to build here. You also have to look at this as that they look at the government, not just the king, but the government as being all powerful. The government as being all sovereign. And again, contrast with the all sovereign government, contrasting with God, who is truly sovereign, truly in control. So we continue on here. And so to all the supervisors of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, counselors, and governors, to all of them, it probably wasn't all of them. There were 120 of them, just satraps alone. I bet they didn't all just show up. There's probably a core group who just wasn't really happy with what was going on and felt that Daniel was getting a little too much power and needed to bring this guy down a little bit in order to, so they could be powerful as well. And so they come in. They come in to manipulate another king. And it wasn't that they were coming in as like a committee to kind of say, hey, this guy's really kind of not our guy. We don't like him anymore. He's praying to this other god. We don't really appreciate that. He doesn't really like you, king. That sort of thing. It wasn't like that. They came in, and the words and the usage that you see here is that they were looking. This is a witch hunt. It was a angry throng of people who were coming in. That's distracting. They were coming in, and they were. It's a witch hunt, and they were coming in to get Daniel. They wanted to take him out, and they wanted to manipulate the king. They needed, like I said, they wanted to find the arrogance of the king, and they wanted the king to make a law, literally a law, that would allow Daniel to eventually get killed. So as we continue on here, 8 and 9, they tell the king pretty much what he needs to do here. I'm going to switch over to another version as we go through this part, just because it's a little bit easier to work through. They wanted him to, they're telling the king what to do there in verse 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so it may not be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. The king was not more powerful than the law. And so that was what they were saying here. So even if the king changes his mind, there's a little bit of a loophole later on, but even if the king changes his mind, an edict or a law that has been signed and sealed and delivered by the king cannot be broken or cannot be changed. And they knew that, and that's why they're bringing this up. And then they therefore, in verse 9, because of what they said, therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. So they manipulate, they find the arrogance of the king, they manipulate him, they come to him and say, you're the great king, you should live forever, there's this guy, well, he didn't say specifically that way, but there's, you need to make this decree, you need to make this edict, and if you don't, well, bad things are going to happen. So let's continue on going back up there. Where did I go? Let's look at verse 10, and we'll go through verse 14. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Sorry, thank you. Daniel knew what was going on. He knew that these guys did not like him. It wasn't, they probably didn't hide it. They probably had already threatened him, or it probably wasn't a fun situation for anyone, right? And so as we look here, he goes up there and he goes into public to pray. This is actually, even though it's on the rooftop of where he was living, it's a very public spot. People could have seen him do this because, first of all, you see that his windows were open toward Jerusalem, so someone walking by or on roofs around in the area could see that this monotheist guy is praying to this Yahweh that he's always prayed to. So he's not changing his ways. He's not going to say, you know what, these bad guys or these mean guys are coming after me, and if I just kind of hang low for a while, and the king will forget it because he's got other things going on, or he'll die. And then that edict dies, or something else will happen and everything kind of goes our way. No, Daniel continues to do his thing because his faith, as we see, is stronger than these fake laws that are coming in and are happening from these other satraps and this king. So he knew his sign. He kneeled. He continued to pray to God 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. So no changes for God. And some people would say, well, what about Matthew 6, 5 through 6, where it says people shouldn't pray in public. But there's a reason for that. There's a reason for why he was doing that, because we had our Pharisees and other related moralistic friends, Jewish friends, who were out there in the middle of the city streets or on the street corners or whatever, and they were praying out loud and these very just wonderful, beautiful in their mind prayers to God, and just being loud and boisterous about it. Is mainly for their own fame, their own gratification. Now, yeah, Jesus didn't like that. And that's why he talked about it. he did not, as we know, Jesus was not a big fan of the people who were self-righteous, trying to make themselves look good, the moralists, and that sort of thing. Daniel, on the other hand, this is what he does. He probably opened the windows every day to Jerusalem. He's not just kind of, hey, I'm gonna now open my windows today to Jerusalem. He was doing that because that's what he did. But at the same time, what he's doing is that he's doing this as a form of rebellion against those who are oppressing him, oppressing his people. Though he was someone who obviously was in good standing with the Persian king, he at the same time still was significantly a Yahweh follower, and he did not want to acknowledge the power of the king. He wanted to acknowledge the power of God, his God. So as we go on into this, in verse 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making a petition and supplication for his God. They didn't happen to walk by. We all know this. They were stalking and spying on Daniel and just waiting for him to make that mistake. Of course, it didn't take that long, because it seems as soon as Daniel knew, he went ahead and prayed. So it's not like Daniel waited a week and it took a week for these guys to figure it out. It happened pretty instantly when it was all said and done. Some would say that the way they found Daniel, the usage here is probably really nice. It's probably nicer than what really happened. I'm going to see if it says a little bit different here in this translation. I can't remember right off. It came by collusion. That's a little bit harder word. Some would say that the word collusion there in verse 11 probably would have brought him a little bit more like they barged into Daniel's home. Barged in as in they were just really looking to find him, and they wanted to surprise catch him. I could see the usage there for that, but it's either way, they're spying on him. So as we continue on into verse 12, it's getting more and more exciting every minute as we go forward here. So they see Daniel doing, and as they go into verse 12, they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction, and they asked him a question. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? Again, Daniel could have hid out for 30 days, right? I mean, if it's 30 days... Oh, thank you, Carly. Is mobbed. Oh, I like that. Yeah, mobbed for the word of... for what we're like the collusion or going in. So yeah, barging in. So they did that. So anyways, thank you. Good comment. It's good to have a comment there. As we continue on here, they try to remind the king, and they ask him a question about it. It's almost like, did you forget? Or are we not clear? Or is there some way that this guy wasn't clear? It's very odd how they're acting this out. So anyways, they asked the question. The king had a reply. The statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. That the king said this again, he's kind of setting him up to he's going to have to do this no matter what. He is not above the law as this continues to go forward. Oh sorry. Just a second. There we go. All right. I have to ask Brian Chittenden about those lights going off when we're not moving enough. All right. Anyways, as we continue on here, in verse 11 and 12, they report Daniel's actions. Obviously, they do not have much respect for the king. They get him to restate it. This is just a very arrogant thing. So it's an arrogant group of people going up to an arrogant man, and they're all kind of working this together to take Daniel out. But unbeknownst to the king, he did not know what he was doing. And then 13 gets very interesting here. And some would say that there's a very much anti-Semitic instance here. I mean, if you look at verse 13, they remind the king. So let's look at 13. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, as in he is not one of us. He pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. So he continues to pray to his God 3 times a day, right? So there's a lot going on here. First of all, you have the anti-Semitic, xenophobic idea, or just racism in general against this Jewish man or this man from Judah. So you have this going on. You also have the idea, and this is where it comes a little bit more on the religious side, is that the idea of the petitions is that the people would bow to the king or pray to the king or put a petition to the king, and the king would then take that and as a priest and take that to the gods. And so the king is acting as a priest. And again, that would be completely counter to how the Jewish people would look at this. Like, of course, you would pray to God, or you would make sacrifices at the temple, and the temple would be the priest would be an intermediary and all that. And so you have this pagan priest kind of being an intermediary between, the people and the pagan gods. And just like you'd have the intermediary of the priest and Yahweh and the people, and you have that in between as well. And so the author is making a point here related to how the pagans are trying to pervert this idea or this way of this religious way of the Jewish people. And so we have that, like I said, you have the racist side of this. You have them kind of beaten down or mocking the Jewish belief and how they petition. And so for the most part, they're calling out Daniel, who is supposed to be at one point head over all the kingdom according to the king. And so you have all that happening here in verse 13. So it's a very, very important verse as we look through this. As we go into verses 14 and 15, we see that the king is not too happy about this. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. And he set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king, and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." So the king is trying to figure this all out. He's like, is there any way I can get around this? Is there any way that I can make sure that this guy that I like, obviously he likes him some way, in some way, to want him to be leader of the entire nation, or at least oversee the entire nation. Maybe there was some sort of friendship there. Maybe there was some sort of mutual respect. Anyways, the king was not happy about this and really did not want to deliver Daniel into the lion's den. And so he kept on thinking about it until sunset, and trying to really figure out different ways to do that. Well, obviously the other leaders, the other satraps, and other kingdom leaders came to him and said, "Hey, you're kind of stalling here. You're delaying. The law is the law. You signed the law. You made this edict, and now you have to fulfill it." Now, on the king's side of this as well, it is one thing that he did have to think about from a long-term implication, even though Daniel was possibly a friend or a close acquaintance of his. One thing that he had to think about is, for political reasons, if he were to say, you know what, I'm gonna just kind of throw this one off to the side. This Medo-Persian law that I've established, I can't revoke it, because if he revoked it, that could turn into a free-for-all. It could be almost literally political suicide. It could have been to where the people now decide to overthrow this weak king who can't keep a promise. It could be one of the things where anarchy and social disorder happens because, well, the king has no power because he won't even keep a simple injunction such as this. So there's that tension too. So he has the tension of, he has a friend who doesn't want to get thrown into the lion's den. He also has the tension of, well, also don't want this place to go into mass chaos and anarchy. And anyways, the other leaders saw that the king was stalling, and so they prayed for the most part, forces the king's hand to take Daniel and put him into the lion's den. So as we continue on here, and we'll go, next three verses will be 16 through 18. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, this is very important what he says. He's almost a little bit religious here. He sees that Daniel believes in a God, that he's monotheistic, You can see here, especially based on how the author used the word God, he's not looking at this as a God of one of multiple gods. Well, he could be like God of gods, kind of like what Nebuchadnezzar would do, God over all gods, or Almighty God, or highest God, still admitting that there's other gods. But he said, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. And so we see that. So there's a little bit of religion here. He's not obviously a follower of Yahweh at this point, but he has some hope. He has some hope that Daniel's God, the God that Daniel believes in, will rescue Daniel. So as we go on, a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing will be changed in regard to Daniel. So there's this, of course, they moved that big stone over. It's like the ring, of course, they would put in there is over a special kind of clay that would eventually harden very quickly, and then it was sealed, and no one could open that. So we have this reluctant signing of the seal is now closed. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. So he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. Some say that he possibly prayed. Maybe he tried to pray to Daniel's God, based on how some of this is used here. Fasting, and I bring that up because the use of fasting, it's not always necessarily just not eating. There's other forms of fasting, but also petitioning to God, or praying to God, or some sort of a religious act, maybe even some sort of religious meditation that he did to help appease Daniel's God, or something to make sure that Daniel would not be killed. So as we continue on here in verses 19 through 20, the king who was not able to sleep, I imagine we've all had nights like that, the king rose at dawn and the break of day and went to haste to the lion's den. The reason he ran quickly is, some would say he ran quickly because he wanted to see if his friend had been killed. I would, sure, why not? Others would say he ran quickly because he knew that at dawn, that if someone survives a night of torture, or a night in the lion's den, or fiery furnace, where you want to be, if someone survives that, and you get there right after dawn and they're still alive, you can pull them out of there and they will be okay. They no longer have to face the sentence. And that could have been why he ran quickly. Take your pick. Was he pardoned from his crime would he be pardoned from his crime for surviving the night? You can also look at this as that maybe he had some faith in Daniel's God because of the amount of faith that Daniel had in his God, in his own God, that the king was like, man, if this guy has this type of faith. As you see here, Daniel doesn't say anything when he gets tossed into the lion's den. It's not like, oh no, wait, I'm gonna hold off, I don't want to do this, or give me another chance, or anything like that. He was silent. And we've seen that before too, earlier in Daniel, the book of Daniel. So he goes in there in peace. He knows that if God will deliver him, or God may not deliver him, but that is okay. God is still God, and he still believes in God. Again, kind of like Esther, when she made that choice to tell the king that she was a Jew, either that would go really well for her and the people would be saved, the Jewish people would be saved, or it'd go really bad for her and she'd be killed and bad things would happen to the Jewish people. But either way, she had to do something, and she knew that God would be faithful. And that's a similar sort of situation that we have here with Daniel. So he was hopeful. If you go into verse 20, when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. He was hopeful, but yet he was a little bit of doubt, a little bit of anguish, as we see here. He kind of got there, wasn't quite there. Then he spoke to Daniel. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Could you imagine? What a question to be saying first thing in the morning, yelling down to a lion's den that in the past has been used and people died very quickly. And so there's this ongoing kind of underlying thread of hope and faith throughout all this. And so we continue to see that here. Then Daniel spoke. First time Daniel spoke. And he said to the king, "O king, live forever." That's just a very nice way, even though you don't mean it. It is a nice way to refer to the king. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me inasmuch as I have found innocent before him, as an innocent before God, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime." So we see Daniel finally is finally able to talk, or finally is allowed to talk, or finally given a little bit of dialogue here in the book. He's able to speak to the king. The king is pretty excited about this, as we'll see in verse 23. This angel of the God came down and incapacitated the lions. The lions could not do anything. What exactly that means, we weren't in there. We don't know. Did he shut the lions' mouths? I mean, but they still have claws. It's like one of those things. Like, well, what? Anyways, the lions didn't do anything to Daniel. The angel was probably a similar sort of angel like we see in Hagar, when Hagar is told of Ishmael's birth, or the angel in the burning bush. Very, very much so. It could have been some sort of theophany of God, or it could have been an angel like a Gabriel. But anyways, it's a representative of God who came down, and a representation of God that came and was in there in the den with Daniel and kept him safe for the night. And then Daniel said that he didn't commit a sin against God, of course, because Daniel continued to do what Daniel was in a faithful way. But he also didn't really do anything against the king. And the reason he did anything against the king is because this was not a real law. The king was manipulated into doing this. And so Daniel is ordered out of the to be taken out of the den. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders to Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in God. Now, this is interesting. Daniel didn't say, "Yay, nothing happened to me because I trusted in God." No dialogue there. The king didn't say it. This is something that the author entered into this for the people who are reading this to see. The reason that this man was saved, the reason that this man was not injured, was because he was faithful. He was faithful to God, he trusted in God, and God rescued him. And so that is something that the author has inserted into this text. You're kind of a little extra piece of information for us here. As we continue on, we see some really bad things start happening to the bad people. The king then gave, I'm in verse 24, the king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So, again, kind of give us a good idea. These lions were probably hungry. The lions were obviously very fierce, ferocious. And they didn't like anyone. They would eat you as soon as you landed, or not even landed, in the den. There's a lot of debate about the children. Some would say it was just the sons, because the sons who were the ones who'd be, of course, next in line. Others would say the children were the boys and girls, daughters and sons. Most likely, it probably was everyone. It probably could have even included pretty much anyone who was in the household. It could have included, cousins and servants and everything. And the reason they would do that is because they didn't want any sort of rebellion or any sort of a group trying to, we're all now really upset with the king because of what he did, and he allowed this Jewish guy to be free and now continue to rule. Because of that, we're now going to rebel. We're gonna start a rebellion. And so, in order to avoid that, the king knew, and most kings did during that time, is that you just don't kill the people who cause the problem; you kill all their family too. And that way, you have a whole lot less chance of a rebellion. And that happens. So, very unfortunate, and that is just kind of the way it worked back then. And so, because you got to think the kids probably didn't have a whole lot to do with this. The wives probably didn't either. Anyways. And so finally, as we wrap this up, we have one more time where a pagan king elicits praise on the Jewish God. So once again, he worships God, or you could say worships the Jewish God, or heaps praises upon him. And we see the sovereignty of God. Again, the sovereignty of God being seen here is that this very, I mean, if you look at the Persians were extremely powerful people, and that you have the sovereignty of God controlling, directing the Persian nation, the Persian country. So you see that here. So as we read through here, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language. Think of Babylon. Who were living in, because we've seen this before. That's the reason I brought that up, is we've seen all languages, or all the languages. This is just kind of helping repeat the history here. Who are living in all the land, may your peace abound. Isn't that nice? To have a king say that. You just hope all kings would say that, or all leaders would say that. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Not Daniel. Not the gods of Daniel, but the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Again, what this king is saying is pretty much the God of creation, the God of everything, the sovereign God. He's saying it without saying it. And it's not just on earth that this happens. It's not just within this kingdom that this happens. It is heaven, so everything in the heavens and everything on earth. Who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Again, 620, I talked about that earlier. Who's this Cyrus guy? Well, wait. Yeah. Something to think about here is that God did not do this miracle to impress the king. He did not do this miracle to impress Daniel. Did not do it to impress us. He did not save Daniel for Daniel's sake. That was not the point of this either. Instead, Daniel was saved so that God could show that he is a God who saves, and show that his power to a lost king, to a lost dark world, right? So which is kind of what our deal is, right? Is that as people who believe in God, as people who are believers, we are to be the light. We are to be the light in the world, and so other people can see in this dark world, who are lost, who are however you want to refer to people who do not know who God is, who lives maybe lives of hopelessness and darkness, that we are the reason things happen the way they happen, many times good or bad, are to point back to God and to point back to who God is as the sovereign, faithful God that we can trust. And that's what the king is saying here. That is what he's telling the people, and this is the life that Daniel was living. That through all this, so even with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and them in the fiery furnace, it wasn't about them coming out without smelling like fire or smoke. It was about God showing that his power, he's a God that saves, and he's a God that you can trust, and he's a God that is faithful, showing that to a pagan world. And that is what we see here with Daniel in Lion's Den, is that to a pagan world, it is unbelievable. To those who do not know any better, to those who do not know who God is, to see that this man would be saved. And again, it wasn't like God did not like Daniel. It wasn't like he wanted to punish him. Or put him through all this. It was that God uses his creation to glorify him and to point people to him, to see who he is and see his power, his sovereignty, and his faithfulness for all this. So that's where we are. We are going to jump into chapter 7 next week. We may do a pre-recording of this next week, and I'll just put it up, and everyone will be able to watch it whenever you have time to watch it. We can do that. Feel free to text or comment back if that's what you like, or prefer just meeting at 6:30 every Wednesday night. I'm okay for the most part either way, depending on the schedules. But anyways, next week we'll be in chapter 7, and we'll probably just, based on where we are right now with our current situation here, we will do a chapter a week for the next couple weeks, and then in chapter 12. And feel free to email me any questions or thoughts, and we can bring that up in the next time we meet, and see how this goes. So I appreciate everyone joining. You guys have a good evening. Thank you.